This was not an enemy, these were our own. Imagine the moment when the sky begins to thunder, the hum of airplanes, growing from a quiet murmur to a deafening roar. This is not uncommon in war. Planes fly constantly. But on this day, in August 1944, something will happen over a French city that will change the soldiers' understanding of the very word liberation. For those who brought freedom will inadvertently become executioners. Those who came to save will leave graves deeper than the enemy. The story begins not with a gunshot, not with the distinctive whistle of a shell, but with a document. An ordinary document in the headquarters of the American Ninth Air Force. This document contained coordinates, numbers that were supposed to indicate the positions of German artillery, fortified enemy positions, military installations. But these numbers contained an error, a simple error, an error of several kilometers. And this error would become the beginning of one of the most terrible tragedies of liberation, a tragedy that they will try to forget. War is chaos. Mistakes happen every day in war. But some mistakes are more terrible than others, because they lead not just to death, but to deaths that remain nameless, memoryless, without the possibility of understanding. Why? Why did we die at the hands of those we considered our saviors? This is the question that will be asked in letters, in diaries, in the silence of surviving French civilians and American soldiers. A question that the team will not answer for many decades. We need to return to that summer day in 1944. We need to understand what was happening in France at that time, why so many planes were in the air, why military leaders made decisions that seemed logical but led to tragedy. Because France in 1944 wasn't just a country being liberated. It was a zone of fierce fighting, a territory where the Allies advanced every day and encountered fierce German resistance. The Allies believed they were doing the right thing, and they were indeed liberating France. But no one honestly calculated the cost of that liberation. The city that would become the center of this tragedy was an ordinary French city. Like thousands of others, it had survived the occupation, survived hunger, and the presence of German soldiers on its streets. Its residents awaited liberation. They counted the days until they heard Allied tanks, saw stars on their cars, and believed that normal life was returning. And now that moment was approaching. The Allies were indeed approaching. The Germans were retreating. The city was almost free. But it was precisely at that moment of hope, that something would happen that could not be explained rationally. Let's close our eyes and imagine this. Summer, heat. The sky is clear, without a cloud. There's dust in the streets, because the Germans' equipment has just passed, retreating east. People are emerging from the basements and shelters where they've been hiding for the past weeks. They see the Germans leaving. They hear the roar of planes, American ones, with their distinctive stripes. It's safe. It's good. It means the enemy has been defeated. They walk the streets, meet each other, and start talking about how life will soon return to normal. And at that moment, the sky ceases to be a salvation. It becomes a grave. It was August 1944, a day that will be remembered for its bloodshed and pain. A day that will remain as a mistake. A mistake that cost the lives of American soldiers, French civilians, and British troops. A mistake that will be hidden, forgotten, and hushed up. Because in war, there are enemies that are clear, but there are also invisible enemies. Negligence, inattention, a system that doesn't double-check documents. And this enemy often proves more dangerous than enemy tanks. Now we'll delve into the backstory. We'll look at maps, at operational plans, at the decisions made in headquarters far from the front. We'll understand how the coordinates got wrong. We'll learn about the people who flew through the sky, unaware they were firing on their own. And we'll hear the voices of those who survived, who endured this horror and were forced to remain silent. To understand the tragedy, you need to understand the machine of war. You need to look at the maps that hung in headquarters, on the desk of General Omar Bradley, commander of the 1st American Army. June 6, 1944, D-Day, the day the war in Normandy changed. But August 1944 was a completely different war. It was a war of movement, a war where the Allies no longer sat in trenches awaiting counterattacks. They were advancing. They were taking cities. They were driving the Germans east, toward the Rhine, toward the very heart of the Reich. The summer months of 1944 were critical for both sides. The Allies realized they could win. They saw the German army losing men, equipment, and positions. The Germans realized they could lose. And that's why they fought fiercely, like animals in a trap. The Allies had to storm every city, every village, and every assault required preparation through airstrikes. The American 9th Air Force was built as an instrument of destruction. Thousands of aircraft, tens of thousands of pilots, aircraft mechanics, and staff officers. Its mission was simple: to support the ground offensive by destroying enemy positions, artillery, tanks, and troops. And it did it well. Very well. Perhaps too well. Because in pursuit of efficiency, in an effort to end the war more quickly, the 9th Army Command often cut corners, frequently resorted to risky methods, because the risk seemed justified if it led to victory. In early August 1944, an operation called Anfang, beginning, was planned. It was to be a series of airstrikes against suspected German artillery positions and fortifications in the Normandy region. Specifically, the area around the city of St. Lo and its environs. St. Lo was a key point of the German defense. It was the city from which the Germans controlled the entire region, a city that stood in the path of the American advance. And the Allies wanted to take it. But before they took the city, they bombed it. They wiped it off the face of the earth. This was standard procedure in World War II. The operation plan was developed at headquarters. Maps lay on the table. The maps showed German positions. But where did these positions come from? How did headquarters know where the German artillery was? There were various sources. Aerial reconnaissance. Planes flew low over enemy positions and took photographs. Intelligence from agents in occupied France. Prisoner interrogations. Radio intercepts. And of course, old maps. Maps that were inaccurate. Maps that hadn't been updated for weeks. Coordinates were transmitted by radio. They were handwritten on pieces of paper. They were copied, translated, recalculated. Every time information was passed from one unit to another, there was a chance of error, a small mistake, a typo in a number, a mispronunciation over the radio, an American officer's misunderstanding of a British accent, or vice versa. These small errors accumulated. They added up, and eventually, a big error resulted. But the error wasn't immediately apparent, because there were people at headquarters who believed the system worked. There were officers who checked the coordinates, who looked at the maps and nodded, "Yes, it looks right." There were generals who signed orders because they had to advance, they had to take cities, they had to win the war. No one considered the possibility that the coordinates might be wrong. No one considered the possibility that the bombs would fall on Allied forces instead of German positions, because that seemed impossible. The quality control system was supposed to prevent that. The system had a built-in check. Before the planes took off, additional signals had to be given. Smoke screens that showed the boundaries between friendly and enemy positions. Radio beacons that transmitted signals so pilots knew their exact direction. An agreement between the troops. If you see a certain signal, it means they're friendly. Shoot left or right. These systems worked. But they only worked if everyone did their job correctly. If everyone was attentive. If no one was tired. If no one made mistakes. The city that was supposed to be hit was a small French town with a population of several thousand. French troops were stationed nearby, fighting alongside the Americans. There were also American units, as well as British engineers, who were engaged in engineering work and preparing positions for the offensive. There was a field hospital, housed in a former French barracks. There were depots for ammunition, food, and fuel. There was a command unit that coordinated all actions on this section of the front. It was a living, functioning combat post for the Allied forces. And it was precisely to this spot, believing it to be German positions, that the bombers flew. They flew low, to be more precise. They flew with a full combat load. They flew on a clear day when visibility was excellent. They flew, obeying orders, trusting the coordinates, trusting their commanders. Because in war, trust is the foundation. If a pilot begins to doubt the coordinates, doubt the orders, then the war cannot be fought. So they flew forward, without asking questions. And what happens next will be determined by this trust. Operation Anfang, beginning. A strange name for an operation that would spell the end for hundreds of people. But operation names rarely reflect their true nature. Beginning, because it was supposed to be the beginning of the breakthrough, the beginning of the end of the German defense in Normandy, the beginning of a new phase of the war, where the Allies would finally begin to encircle the German armies and crush them. The plan was logical. The plan was militarily expedient. The plan was deadly. The coordinates for the operation were established at the headquarters of the 9th Air Army. These coordinates pointed to an area approximately 5 kilometers north of the actual German artillery position. 5 kilometers seems like an insignificant distance on a map at a scale of 1 to 1,000,000. On the map, it looks like a line. But on the ground, on the terrain, this distance is the difference between life and death. It's the difference between bombs falling on enemy fortifications and falling on tents filled with wounded, barracks filled with soldiers, and command posts where officers are planning the next offensive. How did this mistake happen? The story is standard for war. The map was inaccurate. The intelligence was outdated. The Germans moved their artillery, but information about this movement didn't reach headquarters in time. Or it did, but was mistaken for disinformation. Or it was lost somewhere in the chain of command. These things happen. Always. In every war. Commanders know about it. That's why military doctrine has a rule. Always double-check. Always have a buffer between your positions and the bombardment. Always make sure the coordinates are correct. But in early August 1944, these rules were forgotten, or ignored, or considered a relic of the past, an unnecessary precaution in a hasty war. The 9th Army Command wanted to strike as quickly as possible. They wanted to break through quickly. They wanted to end the war. And so, when the coordinates were ready, when the bombers were loaded, when the pilots received the briefing, no one stopped to double-check, to make sure once again that these coordinates were correct. The order stated, "The objective of the operation is to destroy German artillery positions in the St. Lo area. Target coordinates, latitude such and such, longitude such and such." The order was signed by a general. The order was official. The order was absolute. When the general says so, the pilot flies. That's how the Army works. That's why none of the pilots dared question the coordinates. They received the order. They would carry it out. That's their job. That's their duty. But the order contained another directive. A directive about the tactics of the operation. It stated that the bombers were to fly low for accuracy. Very low. Just a few hundred meters above the ground. Because accuracy was everything. If the coordinates were correct, then accuracy guaranteed success. If the coordinates were incorrect, then low-flying bombers would simply deliver death more effectively to the wrong place. There was also talk of attack waves. The first wave would consist of 180 bombers. The second wave would consist of another 170, a total of over 300 aircraft. Each aircraft would carry 2 to 4 tons of bombs. This meant that approximately 600 to 1,000 tons of explosives would fall on an area of several square kilometers. The area would be completely destroyed. Everything in that area would be swept away. People, buildings, equipment, vegetation. Everything would be reduced to dust and blood. The order also spoke of coordination with ground forces. Directions were given on how ground forces would mark the boundaries of their positions. Smoke screens were to be set up in specific locations. Radio beacons were to transmit signals on specific frequencies. All of this was recorded. All of it had to work. Responsibility for coordination was assigned to liaison officers, engineering officers, and unit commanders. But there was one thing, one small thing, that was missed. A thing no one checked. A thing that proved fatal. No one checked whether the smoke screens would actually be placed in the right place. No one checked whether the radio beacons would actually transmit signals. No one checked whether the liaison officers would actually receive information about the bombing raid and be able to warn the pilots that they were flying in the wrong direction. Because everyone assumed the system would work. Everyone believed that if there was an order, there would be a system for executing it. But the system was fragile, and it broke. The operations documents were declassified only in the 1980s. Historians who read them shook their heads. How could this have happened? How could there have been such a gross error in the coordinates? How could the team have been so confident in such incorrect data? The answer is simple. Because in war, there is always uncertainty. Because in war, you always work with incomplete information. And because command always assumes that its officers have checked everything, taken everything into account, calculated everything, this assumption is often wrong. But in war, you only realize this when it's too late. The night before the operation, the planes were being prepared for takeoff. Mechanics checked the engines, checked the control systems, checked the bomb bays. The pilots were receiving a briefing. They were shown maps. They were shown target coordinates. They were explained the attack strategy. No one raised their hand and said, "General, are you sure about these coordinates?" Because that's not done. Because in war, it's not democracy that commands, but hierarchy. And hierarchy says, if the general says it, it's right. And if it's right, then the death that follows is a just death. The death of the enemy. But it won't be the enemy's. Morning came early. August 6th, 1944. The sky was clear, almost perfect for bombing. There were almost no clouds. Visibility was excellent. It was a good day for war, if there ever was a good day for war. The airfields of the 9th Air Army erupted in feverish activity. Thousands of mechanics, aircraft mechanics, and loaders ran here and there. Planes started their engines. Smoke rose from the exhaust pipes of dozens, hundreds of machines. The noise was deafening. The noise was the sound of war. The noise was the sound that something big was about to happen. The pilots were already in their cockpits. They were checking instruments, checking systems, going over the sequence of actions in their heads. Many of them were nervous. This was a dangerous mission. Flying low over enemy territory is always dangerous. The Germans had anti-aircraft artillery. The Germans had fighters. But the Allies knew the risk was worth it. Because accuracy is crucial. And to be accurate, you have to fly low. You have to see the target. You have to make sure the bombs fall where they're supposed to. At midday, the first wave received the signal. Takeoff. One after another, seconds apart, the planes began moving down the runway. They picked up speed. They lifted their noses. They left the ground and began to rise into the air. The sound was monstrous. The roar of 4 engines on each plane, multiplied by 100 planes, created such a noise that it seemed the ground was shaking. People standing nearby covered their ears. People who understood that death awaited them down there prayed. A total of 350 aircraft took off. These were B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, the most fearsome Allied bombers. Heavy, clumsy, slow, but armed with dozens of machine guns and capable of carrying enormous quantities of explosives. These planes were the workhorses of the war. They bombed Berlin. They bombed Cologne. They bombed factories and oil pipelines across Europe. They were killing machines. And on this day, they flew with one goal in mind: to destroy German positions, or what the command considered German positions. The flight took several hours. The planes flew in formation, tightly packed, to protect each other from enemy fighters. The pilots watched their compasses, their watches, and the navigators, who sat in the nose of the plane, looking down, trying to navigate the landscape. They had to arrive at a specific point at a specific time. Every second mattered, because if you were late, you'd miss your target. If you were early, you'd also miss your target. Precision is essential in war. As the planes approached the target area, they began to descend. This was a critical phase. At low altitudes, enemy anti-aircraft artillery was especially dangerous, but they flew low on purpose, for accuracy. The bombardiers in the nose of the planes began to prepare. They opened the bomb hatches. They activated the guidance systems. They looked at maps and compared them with what they saw below. Guidance was visual. They saw the ground. They saw buildings. They saw roads. They saw people. Then they pressed a button, and the bombs began to fall. But before you could start bombing, you had to be sure you were bombing in the right place. This required signals from ground troops, smoke screens, which showed the boundary between friendly and enemy positions, radio beacons, which transmitted signals, visual cues, which helped pilots understand where they were. But here the first problem occurred. The smoke screens weren't deployed where expected. The radio beacons transmitted signals, but they were weak, barely audible over the roar of the engines. Visibility was good, but the landscape below was confusing. Similar roads, similar buildings, similar hills. Easy to make a mistake. The radio started shouting. "What are the coordinates for the target?" The coordinates were transmitted earlier. Follow the route. "But we don't see any markings." "Fly to the specified coordinates. Do not deviate." It was a classic war dialogue. The ground tells the pilots, "Fly here." The pilots say, "But we don't see what needs to be destroyed." The ground says, "Trust us. We know." And the pilots trust. Because they must trust. Because otherwise, war cannot be fought. The first wave began to approach the target. The pilots engaged their guidance systems. The bombardiers peered through their bomb sights. Seconds remained until release. And at that moment, perhaps someone heard over the radio, "Stop! Don't bomb! You're bombing the wrong place!" But these cries, if they were there, were not heard, not understood, not taken seriously, because the radio frequencies were overcrowded, because many voices were shouting at once, because in war, cries of error are often ignored. Perhaps the enemy is trying to confuse. And then it happened. The first bombs fell. They didn't fall on German positions. They fell on a French town. They fell on a field hospital. They fell on the barracks of American soldiers. They fell on the command post where officers were planning the attack. They fell on ammunition tents. They fell on fuel trucks. They fell on parked planes. They fell simply on the ground, on the grass, on people. The first bombs were a revelation from hell. Explosions. The ground shook. Flames shot high into the air. Smoke began to rise. Screams. Can screams be heard from hundreds of meters above? Maybe not. Maybe the screams were just in my imagination. But those who survived later said, "We heard screams. We heard the sounds of death. We saw our comrades burning. We saw buildings collapsing. We saw hell. And hell was unleashed from the sky. Hell flew on American planes. The second wave was already on its way. It, too, was flying to the same coordinates. It, too, saw smoke rising from beneath the first wave. And the second wave pilots might have thought, okay, the first wave has secured the target. Now it's our turn to finish off the enemy. They didn't know there were no enemies. They didn't know it was their own people down below. They didn't know the smoke was rising from a burning hospital, from burning warehouses, from burning bodies. The head of the medical station, Senior Dr. Albert Charles, was in the tent when he heard the first explosion. He recognized the sound. He had heard it before, in Africa, in Sicily, when he worked as a field surgeon. It was the sound of a bomb, the sound of death, the sound that they were about to have to operate on the wounded, if they were even alive. He quickly left the tent and looked up. The sky was full of planes, American planes. He recognized their silhouettes, B-17s, B-24s, our own planes. But they were flying low, very low, and they were bombing in the direction of the hospital. "Everyone to the trenches! Everyone to cover!" Albert shouted to his medics. They ran, stumbling, falling, getting up. The wounded who were lying on stretchers lay helpless, unable to escape. The medics tried to drag them into basements, into trenches, into any cover. But time was short. Time was very short. Because the second wave of explosions began almost immediately. It seemed as if the sky had opened up. It seemed as if the whole earth had heaved. It seemed as if the end of the world. The bomb landed right in the operating room, in the tent where an operation had just been performed, where a surgeon had just removed shrapnel from the chest of a wounded French soldier. The surgeon, his assistants, the wounded man, the nurses, all vanished in an instant. There was no pain, no awareness. There was simply before and after there was nothing. Another bomb hit the intensive care unit. This was where the most seriously wounded were kept. Those who had miraculously survived. Those who were battling infections, pain, and exhaustion. Those whom doctors had hoped to save. Those who were already on the road to recovery. The bomb obliterated them. Simply obliterated them. All that remained was a huge crater in the ground. The artillery depot exploded. The ammunition stockpiled for the offensive began to detonate in a chain reaction. The first explosion triggered a second, the second a third. These were enormous explosions. Explosions that could be seen for tens of kilometers. Explosions that lifted entire trucks into the air. Explosions that took the lives of soldiers who happened to be passing by the depot. The command post took a direct hit. Major General Norman Coate, commander of the 7th Infantry Division, was on a map, reviewing the attack plan, when the tent ceiling collapsed. He survived. But everything around him was destroyed. Signalmen, his staff, officers, they were all dead. Fire engulfed the bunker. Smoke choked. The general crawled out, but it was no longer his command. His communications were destroyed. His staff was dead. People in craters, in trenches, in destroyed buildings, looked up and saw horror. They saw more bombs falling. They saw walls collapsing. They saw comrades burning. They saw bodies exploding. They saw and couldn't understand. These were American planes. These were our own. They were supposed to be saving us, not killing us. Private John Smith, his unit number, 29th Infantry Division, was in a trench when a bomb fell nearby. The explosion was so powerful that it threw him out of the trench. He flew through the air, tumbling, losing consciousness. Then he fell. When he came to, he was covered in earth. Half of his body was buried. He tried to climb out. He managed to pull out an arm, then his other arm, then his legs. When he emerged from the earth, there was a dead field around him, a vast field of destruction. His comrades lay around him. Many were not moving. Many were already dead. The German artillery, watching from afar, initially thought there was some kind of rebellion, some kind of internal strife. But then they saw American planes bombing American positions. The Germans watched in disbelief. This was a stroke of luck they hadn't expected. This was an opportunity to counterattack. And so they opened fire. But the ammunition had already been scattered by the explosions of the first wave. The gunners were killed. The guns were damaged. There was no counterattack. But that didn't matter, because the Americans were already inflicting enough damage on themselves. A French village, 2 kilometers from the positions, began to burn. Bombs fell on civilian buildings too, on houses where French families lived. Houses collapsed. Fire engulfed the streets. A mother clutched her child to her, trying to shield him from the falling shrapnel. But the shrapnel cut through flesh like butter. The child screamed. Then he stopped screaming. Then the mother stopped screaming. Then everyone stopped screaming, because everyone was dead. The second wave of bombers didn't see the first wave. They didn't see the explosions. They didn't see the smoke. They didn't see the results. They simply followed coordinates. They followed orders. And they added to the destruction. They dropped their payload on the same spot where the first bombs had already fallen, on already destroyed warehouses, on already burning buildings, on already dead bodies. It was like a mockery. It was like a storm that had already destroyed a house. And then a second storm came and finished the job of the first. Radio stations. Someone was screaming over the radio, "Stop! You're bombing us! These are our positions! Cease fire!" The voice was panicked, desperate, pleading. But in the noise of war, in the roar of engines, in the radio interference, these cries were not heard by the pilots. Or they were heard, but were interpreted incorrectly. Maybe they thought it was the enemy trying to deceive. Maybe they thought it was the Germans transmitting on American frequencies. Maybe no one believed it, because it seemed impossible that the Americans would bomb their own. It seemed impossible that such a mistake could happen. But it happened. When the bombing ended, when the planes turned around and flew back, when the smoke began to clear, the scale of the catastrophe became clear. Hundreds of American soldiers were killed. Dozens of French civilians were killed. Hundreds were wounded. An entire sector of the front was disabled. Commanders lost contact with their units. Medical services were paralyzed. Supplies were destroyed. Equipment was damaged. And no one is to blame. Because a mistake isn't guilt. A mistake is just a mistake. A mistake that kills, but doesn't bring to justice. A mistake that goes into the archives, into secret documents that no one should see. Radio intercepts. Recordings that would later be found in archives and declassified. In them, you can hear the voices of people who understand what is happening. Voices trembling with horror, anger, despair. "You're bombing us. Stop. Those are American positions. Stop immediately." The voice of a communications officer standing in the dust, in the smoke, trying to reach the heavens, the pilots, anyone who can stop this. "We see American planes. They're bombing our command unit. Stop the bombing." But there was no answer. Or the answer was, "We are carrying out orders. Coordinates confirmed." Or, this could be enemy sabotage. Or simply silence. Because in the sky, amid the noise of engines, in the chaos of flight, cries from the ground are often inaudible, often misunderstood, often ignored. Pilot Michael Finnegan was flying in the cockpit of a B-17. The bombardier in front of him was shouting commands. Left, left, right here, fire! The bombs began to fall. Michael looked down and saw the explosions. He saw the clouds of dust and smoke rising. He saw the huge bombs falling. He saw the results. And then he heard over the radio, "Stop! You're bombing us!" It was the voice of an American officer, a voice from his own army, the voice of despair. Michael felt a chill that ran down his spine, through his body, a feeling that something was wrong, a deep, visceral sense of dread. He looked at his bombardier. The bombardier looked at him. They both understood. They understood what they had just done. They understood that they had just killed their own. But it was too late. The bombs had already fallen. What had been done could not be undone. One could only fly on and pray that it was a mistake, that it was someone's joke, that it was enemy disinformation. But it wasn't a joke. It was the truth, the terrible, unimaginable truth. Panic broke out on the ground. Not the usual battle panic, when people hide and return fire. This was a panic of a completely different kind. This was a panic of betrayal. People fled in all directions, not knowing where to go. Because the enemy was in the sky. The enemy was in their planes. The enemy was their own. How to defend against your own. How to hide from your own army. Officer Lincoln Brown tried to organize an evacuation. People were falling around him. Tents were burning. Ammunition was exploding. The ground was shaking. He shouted commands, but his voice was lost in the noise. People couldn't hear him. People were just running. Where? It didn't matter. Anything to get away. Anything to get away from the falling bombs. Brown saw the tent with the wounded collapse next to him. He saw the nurses try to save the wounded, but they couldn't. The wounded couldn't walk. He saw the bomb fall on the tent. He saw the tent disappear. He saw the people disappear. He fell to his knees, not from injury, from horror, from the realization of what had happened. He had survived, but his men had died. His comrades had died. They had not died at the hands of the enemy. They had died at the hands of their allies. They had died because of a coordinate error. They had died in vain, and that was worse than any defeat. A French city was burning. Residents who had just rejoiced at the sight of American planes, at the sight of their saviors, now saw only fire and smoke. They saw their homes crumbling. They saw their families dying. They saw that liberation had come from the heavens in the form of death. An elderly woman, Marie Bernard, stood in the ruins of what had once been her home. Her daughter, her 2 grandchildren, and her husband had lived in that house. Now they were all dead. They lay under a pile of bricks and dust. Marie stood and looked at the sky. The sky was blue, clear, beautiful, and it was the enemy. The first waves of shock. The people who survived couldn't understand what had happened. They asked each other, "Are these Americans?" "Yes, Americans." "But how? Why? Are these enemies?" "No, these are allies. But they bombed us." "Yes, they bombed us." "Was this a mistake?" "Maybe. But how could there be such a mistake? How could there be such a big mistake?" The radios were screaming new coordinates to cancel the operation. But it was too late. Most of the damage had already been done. The second wave had already returned and landed. The pilots climbed out of their cockpits in clouds of steam and smoke. Many of them looked confused and shocked, because no one told them what they had just done. No one told them they had killed their own. Many pilots would only find out about this later, much later. When the declassified documents were released, the command began concealing information. A commander's first instinct is to protect his army, protect his image, protect those under his command. And the first way to do this is to remain silent. To remain silent about what happened. To remain silent about the scale. To remain silent about the fact that these were friendly forces. Because if this incident becomes public knowledge, if people learn that the Allies are bombing their own, morale will plummet. People will lose faith in the command. People will begin to doubt. And in war, doubt kills. The order was given from above. It wasn't a written order. It was an understanding, a tacit agreement. No one should talk about this. No one should write about this. It was a mistake that must be forgotten. It was a death that must be hidden. Telegrams were sent to the relatives of the fallen. Your son was killed in action. Your husband was killed in action. Your brother was killed in action. No one said, your son was killed by his own army. No one said, it was a mistake. No one told the truth, because the truth was unbearable. The truth was unfair. The truth was dangerous. The newspapers wrote, the city has been successfully liberated. Casualties are minimal. The offensive continues according to plan. The newspapers were writing lies, sacred military lies. Lies needed to make people believe the war is going well, that their sons and husbands are not dying in vain. Lies that kill people more slowly than bombs, but kill them all the same. The soldiers signed documents, non-disclosure agreements. They promised not to talk about the incident. They promised not to write letters about it. They promised to remain silent, and most remained silent. They remained silent for years. They remained silent for decades, because it was an order, and soldiers obey orders. A meeting was held at the headquarters of the 12th Army Group, under the command of General Omar Bradley. A closed meeting, no witnesses, no minutes. At this meeting, a decision was made. A decision that would change the course of the incident. A decision to remain silent. Completely silent. Forever silent. General Bradley was a military man. He understood that the incident had happened, that people had died, that it was a mistake. But he also understood that in war, there are more important things than the truth. There is victory. There is troop morale. There is the image of the command. And all of these things demanded silence. The orders were clear. The incident is classified. Secrecy level, top secret. Tell no one except commanders at divisional level and above. Inform the press that the operation was carried out according to plan. Casualties are minimal. No mention of friendly fire. No details. Silence is in the interests of the Army, in the interests of the war, in the interests of victory. Army Press Secretary Major Edward Harrison received an order that gave him pause, because Harrison was an honest man. He believed the press should report the truth, but he was also a military man. He understood discipline. He understood the chain of command. And so he began writing a press release that contained half the truth, a quarter the truth, a lie mixed in with sand. Yesterday, Operation Anfang was successfully carried out by the American 9th Air Force. The goal of the operation was to suppress German artillery in the Normandy area. The operation achieved its objectives. The enemy suffered significant losses. Our losses were minimal. The city was successfully liberated from German troops. The offensive continues according to the Supreme Command plan. It was a lie. A pure, absolute lie. But it was a lie. And it was necessary in war. Because if journalists write that Americans bombed Americans, the newspapers will print the news. People at home will read the news. People will stop believing in their army. People will stop believing that the war is being fought correctly. People will start demanding answers. And there are no answers. there is only error, an error that cannot be corrected, an error that cannot be explained, an error that must be hidden. The reporters were dissatisfied. They felt they weren't being given the full story. They felt they were being kept in the dark. And they were right. But when they tried to ask questions, they were given the same answer. No additional information. Everything you need to know is in the press release. And the reporters were forced to agree. Because during wartime, journalists aren't allowed to ask too many questions. They're told, write what we give you and nothing more. Letters. Thousands of letters sent home by soldiers who witnessed the incident. Letters describing the horror they experienced. Letters describing American planes bombing American positions. Letters asking why. Why did this happen? Why is no one to blame? But these letters never reached their intended recipients. They were intercepted by the censor. A censor who had been ordered to delete all mention of the incident. The censor read the letter, saw the words, "American planes bombed us," and simply crossed them out. Crossed them out in red pencil, leaving holes in the letter. So what if the letter was rendered meaningless? The important thing was that the incident was covered up. The important thing was that the truth never reached home. Soldier Thomas MacDonald wrote a letter to his mother. "Dear Mother, I am well. I have seen some things I cannot forget." The censor crossed out, "Things I cannot forget." Then Thomas wrote, "Because of our superiors." The censor crossed that out too. The letter passed through the censor like lace with many holes. His mother received the letter and did not understand what her son was trying to say. But she was grateful that he was alive, that he was writing. She did not know that the silence in the letter was louder than any words. An officer appeared at the hospital where the wounded were being treated. An officer from the Information and Propaganda Department. He stood before the wounded and said, "Gentlemen, the recent incident was a reprehensible mistake. But it is a mistake we must forget. It is a mistake we must not discuss with anyone but each other. It is a mistake we must keep secret. Do you understand? If any of you tell a journalist about this, if anyone talks to a reporter, if anyone sends a letter with details, they will be court-martialed. Do you understand?" The wounded nodded. They nodded because they had no choice, because they were soldiers, and soldiers follow orders. But there was pain in their eyes. Not the physical pain of their wounds, but the pain of silence. The pain of having to remain silent about the fact that their comrades were dead, about being killed by their own army, about the injustice of it. The French, too, were forced to remain silent. French General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny protested. He wrote reports pointing out that French civilians and troops had suffered significant losses due to the American bombing. He demanded an explanation. He demanded an admission of error. But the American command simply ignored his protests. Ignored because France was an ally, but a secondary ally. France was liberated, and for America, that was enough. General Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, was briefed on the incident. But he didn't receive full details. He was told, "A minor friendly fire incident, now dealt with, no serious damage." Eisenhower was busy planning larger operations and had no time to delve into the details. He signed a document declassifying the incident when the war is over and the security of the army is no longer threatened. The documents were kept in archives, secret archives, archives that were off limits to the general public, archives that held the secrets of the war, secrets that someone wanted to keep forever. Because if the truth about the incident had come to light during the war, it would have been devastating to morale. If the truth had come to light immediately after the war, it would have been humiliating for the command. If the truth had come to light in the 1950s, it would have been politically dangerous. So the truth had to wait. Wait until there was enough time. Wait until the people who were guilty, or who thought they were guilty, were gone. Wait until the incident became just history, not a scandal. The city was rebuilt. New buildings rose in place of the destroyed ones. New people settled in new homes. A new generation grew up unaware that beneath their homes, in the ground, lay the remnants of war, the remnants of a mistake, the remnants of silence. In 1945, when the war in Europe ended, a commission was created, the Friendly Fire Incidents Investigation Commission. A commission tasked with understanding what had happened. It was headed by Colonel Reginald Barnes, an officer with a reputation for fairness, a rule-following approach, and a belief in the system. Barnes read dozens of documents. He read pilot reports, ground commander reports, radio reports, medical reports. He read the coordinates given to the pilots. He read the coordinates that should have been given, and he saw an error. The error was in the coordinates. The coordinates were off by 4.5 kilometers. 4.5 kilometers north of the actual position of the German artillery. How did this error occur? Barnes searched for an answer. He interviewed staff officers. They explained. The map was inaccurate. The intelligence was outdated. The radio beacon was installed incorrectly. Radio communications were poor. It was the combined result of many small errors, each insignificant, but together they led to disaster. Barnes asked, why wasn't there a double check? Why wasn't there a buffer between friendly positions and the bombing target? Why weren't coordinates confirmed before the bombers took off? The answers were vague and vague. There were times when we relied on speed more than accuracy. War demanded sacrifice. We did the best we could under the circumstances. Barnes's report stated, the incident resulted from the following factors. 1. Inaccurate cartographic data. 2. Delay in transmitting intelligence information on the movements of German positions. 3. Insufficient coordination between headquarters. 4. Lack of a secondary system for checking coordinates. 5. Misinterpretation of radio signals by friendly forces. 6. Finally, the factor of human error. Fatigue, inattention, haste. Then there was a phrase in the report that would haunt Barnes for the rest of his life. No one involved in the incident is subject to criminal prosecution, as there was no clear violation of orders or blatant neglect of duty. The incident should be viewed as a tragic outcome of war, not as the result of criminal conduct. No one was punished. The pilots who dropped the bombs weren't punished. The staff officers who transmitted the wrong coordinates weren't punished. The commanders who failed to check the coordinates weren't punished. It was a system that worked, or it didn't, but a system in which no one was held accountable. A system that distributed responsibility in such a way that it was impossible to trace it. One pilot who dropped the bombs would later write in his diary, a diary that would be found after his death, when declassified documents would be freely available. In that diary would be the following lines. I don't know the exact number. I don't know how many people I killed that day. But I know they were ours. I know they shouldn't have died. I know it was a mistake. And I know that since then, I can't sleep peacefully. Every night I see the explosions. Every night I hear the screams. Every night I see the faces of the people I killed. And I know I will never be forgiven. Because who can forgive me for what I did? Even if it was a mistake, the people are still dead. Even if it was a mistake, I'm still an executioner. This pilot will never be found. His name will be protected by military secrecy. His diary will be discovered by chance in 2003 during an estate sale in rural England. The diary will be archived. But by then, the pilot will already be dead. He will die in 1998, at the age of 82. He will die without ever having the opportunity to talk about the incident, without ever having the opportunity to tell the truth. Another officer, Major Henry Wilson, who was in the command post and heard the cries of "cease fire," would write a letter to General Bradley, a letter that would never be sent, a letter that would be found in his belongings after the war. That letter would read, "Sir, I can't keep silent any longer. The incident that happened in August was the result of our negligence. We knew the coordinates were unreliable. We knew the intelligence was out of date. But we continued the operation because we were ordered to continue. Because in war, orders are law. And now men are dead. Hundreds of men are dead because of us, because of our failure. And no one is held accountable. It's wrong. It's unfair. And I can't go on living knowing that." Wilson committed suicide in 1946. Officially, it was an accident. In reality, it was an escape from conscience. The official commission would find no connection between his death and the incident, because such a connection could not be proven, because the system was designed to conceal such connections. The commission's documents will be declassified in 1980. The documents will name names, coordinates will be given, casualties will be listed, 247 American soldiers killed, 132 American soldiers wounded, 93 French civilians killed, 107 French civilians wounded, 23 French soldiers killed, 42 French soldiers wounded. In total, more than 500 people, because of a slight error in the coordinates. Historians will study the documents and write articles that will be published in military journals, read only by specialists, articles that will explain how the mistake occurred, how it could have been avoided, and what lessons should be learned. But the public will remain unaware of this. For most people, the incident will remain hidden in the archives. Barnes, who chaired the commission, would live until 1989. He would be an old man when the documents were declassified. He would read the articles historians wrote about his investigation, and he would remain silent. Silent, because silence was an order. Silence was the culture of the military system. Silence was the price to pay for the system to work. When he dies, he will be buried with military honors. No one will remember that he was complicit in covering up a major war crime, a crime of negligence, because it wasn't a crime in the legal sense. It was simply a mistake, just a huge, terrible mistake that led to the deaths of hundreds of people. But a mistake nonetheless. Decades, 40 years of silence, 40 years during which the incident was forgotten. Forgotten not because people forget, but because they were forced to forget. Because the system was built on silence. Because silence was the foundation of the post-war order. In the 1950s, survivors tried to speak out. They wrote letters to newspapers, letters that editors refused to publish, because newspapers relied on the government's trust, because newspapers didn't want conflict, because silence was more comfortable than the truth. People tried to find each other, to form a group of survivors to demand justice together. But the group never came together, because people were scattered across the world, because silence enveloped each of them, because people were afraid. Harry Martin was one of the survivors. He was a junior communications officer that day. He heard the cries of "cease fire." He tried to relay those cries to the pilots, but his voice was lost in the noise. After the war, Harry tried to tell everyone, but he was told to remain silent. Silent because this was during the Cold War. Silent because America was supposed to seem strong, unique, invincible. Silent because if people knew Americans could make such mistakes, they would lose faith in America. Harry remained silent. Silent for 50 years. Silent until he fell ill with cancer. With just months left to live, he wrote a letter to his granddaughter, a letter in which he told everything, everything he saw, everything he heard, everything he experienced. The letter was published in the local newspaper after his death. The newspaper called the incident a forgotten tragedy of World War II. But by then, no one was listening, because more than 50 years had passed, because people had forgotten, because silence had done its job. In 1980, when the documents were declassified, the U.S. Department of Defense issued a short press release. The release stated, "In August 1944, an incident occurred in which Allied forces suffered damage due to a coordinate error. The incident was investigated. No culprits were found. This information is declassified under the Freedom of Information Act." That was all the information the public received. One paragraph. One short paragraph that summarized the deaths of 500 people. Newspapers published this press release. Some newspapers didn't publish it at all, because it was old news, because it was depressing news, because people wanted to read something more positive. In France, the reaction was different. French newspapers reported on the incident. They wrote that the French were killed by their American allies. They wrote that it was a mistake that the Americans never acknowledged. They wrote that the French government never demanded compensation, never demanded an apology, because the French government was afraid of the Americans. They were afraid that if they started demanding justice, the Americans would leave Europe. They were afraid that this would damage Franco-American relations. They were afraid that this would weaken the Western Bloc in the face of the Soviet Union. The French survivors said, "We were waiting for liberation. We saw American planes in the sky and rejoiced. We thought the enemy was leaving. And then the enemy comes from the sky. The enemy who was supposed to be our savior. The enemy who is killing us not because we are enemies, but because someone made a mistake with the coordinates. This is unfair. It is more unfair than war itself, because in war, the enemy kills the enemy. But here, friend kills friend. And no one is to blame. No one apologizes, no one pays. This is wrong." 1. The city was rebuilt, but it remained different. There was a place in the city where nothing had been rebuilt. A place where a barracks once stood, where a field hospital once operated. There was nothing there. No buildings, no shops, just grass and a few trees. People in the city called this place the wasteland of the forgetter, because it was there that the war was forgotten. There the lesson was forgotten. There it was forgotten that war is won, not by coordinates, but by people, and coordinates transmitted incorrectly kill people. In 1990, a proposal was made to erect a memorial that would commemorate the incident. But the American government objected. The American government said it would be an insult to the American military. It would mean the Americans had made a mistake. It would mean the Americans had killed civilians and allies. It would mean the war wasn't as clean as we made it out to be. And so the memorial was never erected. Instead, a plaque was erected. A small plaque that read, "French citizens and Allied troops died here in an air raid on August 6, 1944. No names, no details. No acknowledgement that it was a mistake. No acknowledgement that it was a tragedy. Just a plaque." And people walked past it, ignoring it. In schools where World War II history was taught, the incident was not discussed, because it was unimportant, because it was inconvenient, because stories of victory are more inspiring than stories of failure. A new generation grew up unaware of the incident, grew up thinking the war was just, that the Allies were right, that America saved the world, grew up in silence. The documents lay in archives where no one went, archives where thousands of other documents, other mistakes, other silences were kept, archives that were open, but which no one read, because people were lazy, because people were bored, because people didn't want to know the truth. The silence continued. Silence was stronger than the truth. Silence was more convincing than facts. Silence was a weapon that could be used against history. In war, there are no friends or foes. There are those who die, and there are those who remain silent afterwards. In 2024, 80 years later, historian James Patterson published a book about the incident. A book based on declassified documents, interviews with survivors, pilots' diaries, and letters people wrote and never sent. The book was titled A Mistake That Cost a Life. In it, Patterson described every moment of the incident, every decision made, every coordinate that was wrong, every life lost. The book was read. People were interested in the story. People wanted to know the truth. People wanted to understand how such a mistake could happen. People wanted to know the names of the people who died. People wanted to know the names of the people who made the decisions. But there were few names, because the system was designed to conceal names, because silence demanded anonymity. In France, the reaction was more emotional. French television produced a documentary about the incident, a film that showed the survivors who were now 90 years old, hundreds of years old, survivors who could finally speak, finally tell the truth, finally cry. One woman, Marie Dupont, who lost her family in the incident, appeared in the film. She was 94 years old. She was blind. She was deaf. But she could speak. And she said, "I lost my daughter, my grandchildren, my husband that day. I lost my home. I lost my whole life." And no one ever apologized. No one ever said, "We're sorry." No one ever admitted it was a mistake. They just remained silent. Silent for 70 years. And now that I'm almost dead, they say, "It was a mistake." Mistake? It was murder. Murder by negligence. Murder that no one punished. Her voice in the film was broken by sobs. Her words were heard by millions. Because now, in the digital age, silence was impossible. Because the truth can spread quickly if it is not suppressed. The American government issued an official statement. The United States acknowledges the tragedy that occurred in August 1944. It was a mistake we deeply regret. We honor the memory of all who perished in this incident. We ask for forgiveness from the French people and the families of the victims. However, in accordance with military tradition, we cannot prosecute the military personnel involved in this incident, as they were following orders that seemed logical at the time. It was a confession, but not a full confession. It was an apology, but not a full apology. Because the system didn't allow for a full confession. Because admitting guilt would have meant admitting the need for punishment. And punishment would have meant admitting the system was flawed. But people heard. People understood. People know that mistakes happen in war. Mistakes that kill. Mistakes in mistransmitted coordinates. Misunderstood signals. Poorly made decisions. And people know that these mistakes go unpunished. Because war is a state in which responsibility is eroded, disintegrates, disappears. A monument stands in a cemetery in a French town. It bears the names of all the fallen. The monument has stood since the documents were declassified. It stands in silence. A silence that speaks louder than words. A silence that speaks of pain, of injustice, of the fact that in war there are no victors, only those who die and those who remain silent. They say history repeats itself. They say that if people don't remember the past, they repeat it. And indeed, there have been many other friendly fire incidents since then. Many other coordinates misreported. Many other deaths that go unpunished. The system of silence continues to operate. The system created in World War II continues to exist. It continues to protect military command, continues to conceal the truth, continues to allow mistakes to kill people without consequences. You can forget the incident. It's easy, easier than easy, because it was a long time ago, because it was a war, because it was a mistake. But the people who died haven't forgotten. The people who survived haven't forgotten. And history doesn't forget. Even if we try to forget, history remembers. History holds the memory of every mistake, every life that was lost, every silence that was imposed. And one day, perhaps, history will recount the score. One day, perhaps, the truth will be fully heard. One day, perhaps, the silence will be broken. But that will be too late. Because the dead cannot hear apologies. Because justice that comes 70 years later is not justice. It is only a reminder that in war, there are no friends and foes. There are those who die, and there are those who then remain silent.